I stood there numb, my suitcase still in my grip, as my own son, Ryan Brooks, the boy I raised alone after his father died, closed the door in my face. The porch light above me flickered, casting shadows across the welcome mat I bought them last Christmas. Meadow doesn't want his grandmother around too much, he had said. His grandmother. Not his mother. Not Helen. Just a problem to be managed. All right. Before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The sterile scent of disinfectant clung to the air, mingling with the faint aroma of chemotherapy drugs. Helen sat in the worn blue recliner, her body heavy with exhaustion, the rhythmic hum of the IV drip the only sound breaking the silence. Her veins ached, as though they too were crying out for relief, but the relief would not come. She had learned to breathe through the pain. She had to. The nurse, a young woman named Clara, had just finished adjusting the drip, her gentle hands brushing against Helen's arm. All set, Miss Brooks. You'll be feeling better soon. Helen nodded, forcing a smile. She had said those words to herself 100 times over the past few months. Soon. That was the word she clung to, but soon never came. Not really. As the nurse left the room, Helen reached into her bag, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled out her phone. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was a momentary lapse in judgment, but she needed to check. Maybe Ryan had called. Maybe Meadow had softened. Maybe something, anything, would tell her she wasn't as alone as she felt. Her thumb swiped across the screen, and the first thing she noticed was the absence of the usual string of calls. There was no missed call from Ryan, no text messages from Caleb's school, or any familiar reminders of her day-to-day life. Only one missed call. She leaned in, squinting at the screen, the bright letters burning into her tired eyes. The call had come from Ryan, but something wasn't right. There was no recent call history beyond that. A cold rush of realization swept through her. Meadow had blocked her. The same Meadow who had once been so sweet, so eager to please. The same Meadow who had insisted she be included in family gatherings, who had pretended to care. The same Meadow who had, in a cold sweep of her digital finger, erased Helen from her life completely. Helen's heart fluttered painfully in her chest. She clicked Ryan's number, holding her breath. The phone rang, once, twice, and then, as though someone had slammed an invisible door shut, it went straight to voicemail. Voicemail. A dry laugh bubbled in Helen's throat, but it was empty, hollow. Her fingers gripped the phone tighter, knuckles white as she tried calling again, this time dialing faster, her pulse quickening with every failed ring. The endless beep of the voicemail box felt like an accusation, louder than anything Ryan could have ever said to her. She let the phone fall into her lap, her chest rising and falling with shallow, broken breaths. The room was too still. The hum of the IV, the click of the door outside her room, everything sounded muffled, distant. She felt like a specter, caught between the world she had known and the one she was being forced into. The ride home was a blur of red brake lights, the soft hiss of the tires against rain-slicked streets. The night air felt heavier than usual, pressing against the windows as if the world itself had grown weary of her struggle. Every so often she glanced at the phone screen, which remained blank, lifeless in her hand. The phone had never felt so heavy before. Helen wanted to scream, to throw the phone out the window and just let the night swallow her whole. She wanted to slam the brakes and end this ride forever. But there was nothing to do. Just the endless ride back to the bungalow, the house that had once been filled with warmth, but now seemed to hold only the ghosts of better times. When she pulled into the driveway, the headlights illuminated the modest bungalow, a home that once cradled her family with laughter and love, but now felt more like a tomb. She sat in the car for a moment, staring at the dark windows, willing herself to move. The house waited, silent, unyielding. As she stepped out, the weight of the world seemed to settle on her shoulders. Inside, the quiet of the house was deafening. The kettle boiled on the stove, but it remained untouched. The stack of mail was still there, unopened, like everything else in her life that had been left unsaid. Her eyes fell on an old photograph hanging on the wall. Ryan as a young boy, smiling brightly, his arms wrapped around her. They were happy then. She was important to him. She was everything to him. Now, she was nothing. A tear slipped down her cheek, unnoticed. As she dropped her purse on she walked past the small room where Caleb used to play with his toys, where his laughter had filled every corner of the house. But there was no sound now, no light-hearted chatter, just the silence, so thick it threatened to choke her. Her hands shook as she reached for the phone again, her fingers brushing the screen. But this time, she didn't call. She couldn't. There were no words left to say, no hope left to hold on to. She slumped into the chair by the window, the faintest memory of family dinners flickering in her mind. Ryan's laughter, Meadow's smile, Caleb's excited chatter. They were all slipping away from her, little by little, until there was nothing but the blank, cold screen of the phone and the painful silence of a house that no longer felt like home. The phone buzzed in her lap, and for a split second, Helen's heart raced. Maybe it's Ryan, but when she looked down, there was nothing there. Nothing at all. The house was eerily quiet. The faint whistle of the kettle on the stove was the only sound breaking the stillness, but Helen didn't have the energy to pour herself a cup of tea. The thought of warmth, of soothing comfort, seemed too distant now, a luxury she could no longer afford. The kettle continued to boil, its steam rising in fragile tendrils, only to dissipate into the air. Another echo of something fleeting, something once vibrant, but now lost. Helen sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded in front of her, as though she were still trying to hold herself together. But it was getting harder. The house that had once been full of laughter, of Ryan and Caleb running around, now felt like a tomb. The silence pressed in from all sides, the walls too close, suffocating. Her gaze drifted to an old framed photograph on the wall. Ryan as a little boy, grinning ear to ear with his arms wrapped around her. His eyes, full of warmth and innocence, were locked onto the camera, unaware of how things would unravel. Back then, she had been his world. And now, she couldn't even get a simple phone call returned. The sight of the photo hit her like a punch to the gut. The edges of the frame were worn, the glass slightly scratched, evidence of years past, years that had, until now, been filled with family, with love. It used to be that Ryan's voice would ring through the house, full of the careless chatter of a boy who loved his mother. But that boy was long gone, replaced by a man who barely acknowledged her existence. Helen closed her eyes, fighting back the tears. Was I ever enough for him? The thought lingered, like a dark cloud, heavy with self-doubt. Was it her illness that made her a burden to him? Was it too much for them to see her struggle, to watch her fight for breath as she fought for life? She couldn't help but feel that in the eyes of her son and his wife, she had become a shadow, a reminder of sickness, of weakness. And Meadow, well, Meadow had always been so keen to erase any trace of the past, to build a shiny, perfect life. And Helen? She didn't fit into that vision anymore. She reached for her phone again, her fingers trembling as she dialed Ryan's number. The familiar buzzing sound was like an omen. Each ring felt like it took a piece of her, until it was nothing but a hollow echo in the empty house. Voicemail. Again. She felt the frustration bubble up, hot and sharp. How could he do this to her? How could he just let his wife, his own wife, treat her like she didn't matter? Please, Ryan, pick up. Just pick up. She repeated the words silently in her mind, almost willing the phone to connect, to break the silence, to remind her that someone, anyone, cared. But there was nothing. No ring, no voice, no answer. She dropped the phone onto the table with a soft thud. Her chest felt tight, and the walls of the kitchen seemed to close in around her, a cage built from years of unspoken hurt. Helen stood up, her legs weak beneath her as she wandered through the house. Her feet led her automatically to the window, to the view of the street where Caleb's school bus would pass in the afternoons, the same street where she had once waved excitedly as he ran to her with his backpack swinging, his face full of joy at the end of another school day. She hadn't seen him in weeks. From the window, she could see the familiar yellow bus pulling into the stop a few houses down. The kids spilled out, laughing, their voices rising in a carefree chorus. And then, in the distance, she saw him, Caleb. He was walking with his head down, his small figure hunched as though trying to make himself invisible in the crowd of children. But it was him. It was her Caleb. A lump formed in her throat as she pressed her palm against the cool glass of the window, watching him. She wanted to call out, to rush out the door and wrap her arms around him, to tell him she was still here, that she hadn't left him. But there were no words. Not anymore. The distance between them felt like a chasm, one she couldn't cross, no matter how hard she tried. Caleb looked up for just a moment, his eyes meeting hers through the window. But before she could raise her hand in greeting, he quickly turned his head and kept walking. The ache in Helen's chest deepened, a sharp gnawing pain. She didn't know what hurt more, the fact that he had turned away from her, or the fact that she knew, deep down, he was only doing what he had been taught to do. Helen's breath hitched, her eyes stinging. The phone in her pocket buzzed again, but she didn't bother checking. It could be anyone except Ryan, anyone except the family that had once been hers. She didn't need to know. As she stood there, staring out at the empty street, the silence in the house grew even heavier. The kettle had long since stopped whistling, its contents cooling in the pot, just like the love she had given, just like everything she had once held dear. And for the first time in a long time, Helen wondered if the fight was even worth it anymore. Would she ever get them back? Would her son ever see her again? Truly see her? She shook her head, the tears slipping down her cheeks unnoticed. She had no answers, only the quiet, cold weight of a house that felt less like home every day. Helen's hands trembled as she adjusted the collar of her coat, trying to steady herself. The air outside had a chill to it, but it wasn't the cold that made her shiver. It was the weight of what she was about to do, the weight of a mother walking back into the life that had once been hers, only to find it slipping further from her grasp. She had driven to their house on impulse, driven through the neighborhoods where once she had dropped off birthday gifts, where she had waved goodbye to Caleb as he dashed off to play with friends. The path to their home was the same as it always had been, but everything felt different now. The trees that lined the street seemed barren, the houses too silent, too perfect. Not a sound of children running in the yard, no laughter echoing down the block. As she parked in front of the two-story house, Helen sat for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She couldn't decide what she was hoping for. A miracle? An apology? A son who would remember the woman who had been his whole world? Or simply a conversation? Anything to bridge the chasm that had grown between them. When she finally stepped out of the car, the weight of her body felt heavier than it should. She had long stopped expecting anything resembling warmth from Meadow, but she had hoped, at least hoped, that Ryan might be different, that there might still be a flicker of the boy who had once adored her. The front door swung open, and there she was, Meadow. The same polished smile, the same cool, controlled demeanor. "Hello, Helen," she said, her voice a little too sweet, a little too forced. Helen's heart clenched. The polite veneer that Meadow wore like armor didn't fool her. It never had. But today, it stung more than usual. Meadow stepped forward, blocking the doorway, as if the threshold between them had grown wider with every passing day. "I'm sorry, Helen, but this isn't a good time." Helen's chest tightened. "I just wanted to see Caleb. I miss him." Meadow's smile didn't falter, but her eyes hardened. "I understand, but it's really not a good time right now." Helen felt her pulse quicken. Not a good time? The words felt like a slap, like a cruel dismissal of everything she had ever been to this family. "I just want a minute," she said, her voice softer now, but desperation creeping into her words. "Please, just a minute with my grandson." As she spoke, she saw Caleb. He was standing behind Meadow, his small face peering from around her waist. The moment their eyes met, Caleb's face lit up, a hesitant smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He took a step forward, his feet unsure, like he wanted to run to her but was being held back by something invisible. But before Helen could open her arms, Meadow moved quickly, stepping in front of Caleb and pulling him back. "Caleb, come here," she said in that sharp, command-like tone. Helen felt her heart shatter. "She's blocking him from me. She's blocking my own grandson." Caleb looked up at his mother, confused, his brows furrowing. There was a brief moment where his gaze flickered back to Helen, and Helen could see the confusion in his eyes. He wanted to come to her. He wanted to reach out. But Meadow's hand on his shoulder was firm. Too firm. "Mom, I really think you should go," Meadow said now, her tone changing, more final. "This isn't the right place for whatever it is you want from Ryan and me." Helen's mouth went dry. Her chest ached with a pain so raw, so sharp she almost couldn't breathe. "This is it. This is the world they've built for themselves, without me." She turned slowly, her legs feeling weak beneath her, the ground beneath her feet strangely distant. As she walked toward the gate, she heard the sound of the door closing behind her, the click, echoing in her mind, sealing the finality of the moment. Her steps were slow, heavy as she walked down the driveway. The neighbors were beginning to peek through their windows, their faces curious, watchful. No one said a word, but their silence was louder than anything. They've all seen it. They've all seen her push me out, seen me as nothing more than a shadow. Helen reached the sidewalk, her fingers wrapped tightly around the strap of her purse, and just as she stepped off the curb, she heard the faintest sound, a voice, weak, almost swallowed by the distance. "Grandma?" It was Caleb. Helen froze. The world seemed to stop for a moment. She turned, her heart racing. Caleb was standing on the porch, a few steps from the door, his small hand raised in a tentative wave. His eyes searched hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He was calling to her. He was reaching out. But before she could take a step toward him, before she could say anything, Meadow appeared in the doorway again, her voice cold and firm. "Caleb, come inside." The moment shattered, the door closing behind him with a finality that felt like a death knell. Helen's heart cracked wide open. She turned away, her chest tight with the weight of the unspoken goodbye. Her mind screamed to go back, to fight, to tear down the walls they had built around her. But as she walked away, each step heavier than the last, she realized there was nothing left to fight for. The door had been closed, and she was never going to be allowed inside again. The hospital hallway smelled like antiseptic and bleach. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, flickering slightly as Helen made her way to the oncology ward. Every step she took felt like it was sinking her deeper into a space she could no longer control. The chemotherapy had drained her energy, yes, but it was the loneliness that gnawed at her more than anything. The empty calls, the blocked messages, the silence that stretched for days. It was as though the people she loved had turned their backs on one by one. As she approached the nurse's station, she heard the muffled sound of voices from around the corner. At first, she thought it was just the usual chatter, but then one voice broke through the noise, sharp and unmistakable. "She's always so dramatic," Meadow's voice rang out, cutting through the hospital air like a blade. Helen froze in place, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't meant to overhear, but the words hung in the air, heavy with disdain. Meadow wasn't even trying to be subtle. "Can't she just get over it already? It's not like she's dying," Meadow continued, her voice a cold mockery. "I don't know why Ryan's putting up with her. She's exhausting." Helen's stomach churned, a wave of nausea threatening to overwhelm her. She stood there, rooted to the spot, her hand gripping the edge of the counter, her mind spinning in disbelief. The woman who had once welcomed her into her family, who had pretended to care about her, was now mocking her, dismissing her pain like it was some inconvenience she'd grown too weary to tolerate. "And don't even get me started on her cancer," Meadow added, her tone dripping with venom. "She's only got herself to blame for being sick. Maybe if she hadn't let herself go, it wouldn't be so bad." Helen's hand flew to her mouth, the sting of those words cutting deeper than any physical pain she had felt. How could she say that? She had raised her son. She had loved him unconditionally, and this is how he had turned out. Cold, distant, and now completely under the influence of a woman who seemed determined to erase everything about their... Tasha, the nurse, was the first to notice her standing there. She came around the corner, her sharp eyes immediately taking in Helen's ashen face. "Miss Brooks?" Tasha asked, her voice soft but concerned. She placed a gentle hand on Helen's arm. "Are you all right?" Helen shook her head, blinking rapidly as if waking from a nightmare. She forced a smile, but it felt so thin, so fragile. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. But Tasha wasn't fooled. She reached up and brushed a stray tear from Helen's cheek, her expression one of quiet empathy. "Don't let them get to you," she said, her voice steady. "People like that, people who can't even try to understand, they don't matter." Helen felt her breath hitch in her chest. Tasha's words weren't just kind, they were a lifeline, a reminder that, even if the rest of her world was falling apart, there were still people who cared, who saw her, who believed in her. Tasha didn't say anything more. She simply stayed with her, her presence warm and steady, until Helen managed to collect herself. But the damage had already been done. The words Meadow had spoken were still swirling in Helen's mind. She's exhausting. She's always so dramatic. I'm exhausting? I'm dramatic? All of it felt like a condemnation, a verdict, sealing her fate in this twisted new version of reality that Meadow and Ryan had created for her. Later, back in the solitude of her hospital room, Helen found herself unable to concentrate on anything. The chemo had left her weary, and her thoughts kept circling back to Meadow's cruel words. She couldn't escape them. She couldn't escape the sting of rejection, the coldness that seemed to bleed into every interaction she had with her son and his wife. She walked over to the small desk by the window, where a leather-bound journal lay open. Her hand hovered over the pages for a moment before she picked up the pen. Her thoughts poured out quickly, the ink scratching across the paper in sharp, uneven strokes. She wrote everything down. The way Meadow had mocked her, the coldness she had felt from Ryan, the confusion that had begun to fill her heart. She had always tried to keep things together, to be strong, to be the mother and grandmother they needed. But now, she wasn't even sure who she was anymore. She wasn't just battling cancer. She was battling a loss that went deeper than anything physical. A loss of the people she had loved most, a loss of the family she thought she had. The journal pages filled quickly, each entry more desperate than the last. Helen wasn't sure if it was a form of therapy or simply a way to make sense of the chaos, but she kept writing, each sentence grounding her, forcing her to face the truth. Her son was slipping away from her, and no matter how hard she fought, she couldn't seem to pull him back. She closed the journal with a sigh, her fingers lingering on the leather cover. She had written it all down, but it wasn't enough. Nothing would ever be enough to undo the damage Meadow had done. Nothing would change the fact that her own son was parroted the same cruel words. Helen set the journal aside and picked up her phone. She dialed Ryan's number almost instinctively. The call rang once, twice, then straight to voicemail. She closed her eyes, fighting back tears. There was nothing left to say. But still, she couldn't stop herself from saying it, even if it was just to an empty inbox. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I need you to see me. I need you to remember who I am, before it's too late." Her finger hovered over the send button, but she didn't press it. She couldn't. The silence that followed felt more final than any words she could have said. The afternoon sun slanted weakly through the blinds, casting long shadows across the worn couch where Helen sat. She could feel the weight of the silence pressing against her, each tick of the clock on the wall sounding louder than the last. The house was so quiet now, too quiet. Caleb was at school, Ryan was working, and Meadow, well, Meadow had made it clear there was nothing for her here. The phone sat on the coffee table, still, its screen dark. Helen hadn't dared touch it again since the voicemail she had left for Ryan the day before. Her heart still ached with the words she had said, but nothing had changed. A sudden knock on the door startled her, the sound too abrupt in the stillness. She hesitated for a moment, her pulse quickening. It wasn't like Ryan to just show up unannounced. Was it him? When she opened the door, her stomach dropped. It was Ryan, his face tight, his expression unreadable. "Mom," he said, his voice cold and hard. "We need to talk." Helen's breath hitched. Her first instinct was to pull him into a hug, to apologize for the space between them, but his eyes wouldn't meet hers. Instead, he stepped inside, barely acknowledging her as he moved past her into the living room. "Ryan," she said, her voice trembling. "What's wrong?" He took a deep breath, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I've been hearing things, Mom, from people in the community." Helen felt her stomach twist. "What kind of things?" "Things about you bad-mouthing Meadow," he spat out, his voice growing more accusatory. "People are saying you've been saying all this stuff about her, about how she's cruel to you." Helen stood frozen, her mouth suddenly dry. "What?" she whispered, shocked. "I never said that. I would never say anything like that. Ryan, you have to believe me. I haven't said a word." But Ryan's eyes were cold, distant. He wouldn't look at her. The words hung between them, heavy and accusing, like a veil she couldn't tear through. "It's not just one person, Mom. It's several. They've all heard you." "No, Ryan," she interrupted, shaking her head, her heart pounding in her chest. "I never said anything like that. I would never talk about Meadow like that." But as she spoke, the realization hit her like a slap. Meadow had done this. Meadow had poisoned Ryan's mind. She'd crafted stories, lies that painted Helen as the villain, the one causing problems in their perfect life. "She's trying to erase me," She's trying to make Ryan see me as the enemy. I don't know what's going on, Ryan said, his voice tight. But this can't continue. You need to stop. You've been tearing this family apart. Helen's eyes burned with unshed tears. You think I'm tearing the family apart? She choked on the words. You think I'm the problem? Ryan looked down, avoiding her gaze. His lips pressed into a thin line, his posture stiff. Helen could see the conflict in his eyes, the tension in his jaw. He didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to believe his mother could be the one destroying everything. But Meadow's whispers had taken root, and the poison had spread. I just need you to stop, Mom, he said, his voice quieter now but still sharp. I need you to stop making things difficult for everyone. Helen's hands trembled at her sides. Ryan, please. You have to see what's happening. You have to see the truth. I am not the one causing the problems here. From the stairs, a small, hesitant figure appeared. Caleb. Helen's heart lurched. There he was, standing at the top of the staircase, his eyes wide, his small frame frozen in place. He looked at her with such confusion, such sadness, that it felt like a knife twisting in her chest. He had heard everything. Caleb stepped down slowly, his feet dragging. His eyes were full of guilt, his expression torn between his mother and his grandmother. Grandma, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Are you okay? Helen's breath caught. She wanted to reach for him, to hold him close, to tell him everything would be okay. But the words caught in her throat. How could she protect him when she couldn't even protect herself? Before she could respond, Meadow appeared in the doorway, her presence like a shadow, looming over the moment. She stepped forward, her voice cold and smooth. Caleb, go back upstairs, she said sharply. This isn't your business. Helen's heart broke at the harshness in her voice. Caleb looked at her, his face stricken, before turning and running back upstairs. Ryan's eyes followed Caleb for a moment, his jaw tightening. He doesn't need to be involved in this, Mom. This is between you and me. Helen's chest tightened as she stared at her son. Ryan, I'm begging you, please, listen to me. I'm not the enemy here. Please see what Meadow's doing. I'm not making things up. She's pushing me out of your life. She's lying to you. Ryan's face twisted in a mixture of anger and confusion. I don't want to hear any more of this, Mom, he said, his voice rising. I'm done. With that, he turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. Helen stood frozen, her heart breaking as she watched him go. Ryan, please don't leave me, she whispered, but he was already gone. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving her in the deafening silence of the house. The poison had taken hold, and she was losing him. The sterile smell of the hospital room clung to Helen like a shroud as she sat in the recliner, the cold IV drip in her arm making her feel more like a patient than a person. The machines hummed around her, keeping time in a world she could no longer control. The chemotherapy had become a cycle of endless treatment, each one just as draining as the last. The bright white lights above felt blinding, but they were nothing compared to the black hole in her chest that had grown with every passing day. The ache of her body, the weakness of her limbs, it was all temporary. But the ache of being unwanted, of being erased from the lives of the people she loved, was a constant gnawing pain she couldn't escape. Other patients, surrounded by their families, laughed softly, shared jokes, and held hands. Some of them even looked well enough to leave the hospital, their spirits lifted by the comfort of knowing someone cared. But Helen sat alone, a silent observer, her only companion the rhythmic drip of fluids and the muted voices from the hallway. A nurse, Tasha, approached, her steps light, her concern unmistakable. She had been kind to Helen, always offering gentle smiles and quiet words of encouragement. How are you feeling today? Tasha asked, her eyes scanning Helen's tired face. I'm fine, Helen replied, her voice betraying her. Just tired. Tasha studied her for a moment, her expression softening. I'll help you get home, okay? I don't want you making the drive alone. Helen tried to brush it off. I'll be fine, Tasha, really. But Tasha shook her head gently. Let me help. It's no trouble. They walked together through the sterile hallways, the bright fluorescent lights above flickering intermittently. The air in the parking garage felt cooler than it had any right to, but the chill didn't bother Helen. She barely felt the cold anymore. Once inside the car, the ride home was quiet. The only sound the low hum of the engine and the occasional soft sigh from Tasha. Helen stared out the window, her eyes unfocused, watching the passing scenery blur as they made their way to the bungalow. She had never felt so alone. When Tasha dropped her off at the doorstep, she gave her a tight, supportive hug. "Don't hesitate to call if you need anything," Tasha said, her voice genuine. Helen nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you." The door clicked shut behind her, and the silence swallowed her whole. She dropped her purse on the table, her hand hovering for a moment over the familiar clutter of the living room. Everything was still. Everything was untouched, except for the sharp emptiness that filled the space where laughter once lived. She wandered through the house, her steps slow, as though the weight of the world was tied to her ankle. The small, framed pictures on the walls seemed to mock her. Her eyes stopped on one of Ryan and Caleb, the three of them on a beach, their smiles wide and carefree. Back then, it had been enough. It had all been enough. She walked past the kitchen, where a kettle sat cold on the stove, untouched from last night. Her eyes drifted to the counter, where unopened bills piled up. Reminders of a life slipping through her fingers. She hadn't had the strength to deal with them, not when everything else felt so overwhelming. A noise from the living room pulled her attention. She had left her phone on the table, the screen blinking as a new notification came through. She picked it up slowly, not sure she was ready for whatever awaited her. It was a Facebook notification, Caleb's birthday party. There were pictures of the celebration, of Meadow smiling brightly, of Caleb surrounded by his friends and family, but there was one thing missing from the photos: her. A wave of nausea rose in Helen's throat, and she had to steady herself against the back of the couch. They didn't even invite me. They didn't want me there. She let out a shaky breath and glanced at the small wrapped gift still sitting on the table. Caleb's birthday gift, the one she had so carefully picked out with him in mind. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up, the weight of it too much to bear. She had been so proud of it, so sure that this year, things would be different, that she would be part of the celebration, part of his life again. But now it felt like a cruel reminder of everything she had lost. With a quiet sob, she sank down into the chair, the gift still clutched in her hands. The tears came then, falling freely down her cheeks as she rocked back and forth, the weight of her isolation sinking in like an anchor. Even cancer isn't as painful as being unwanted. Her words, soft and broken, hung in the air like a whisper to the empty room. She cried until there were no more tears left to shed, the world around her growing darker as the night closed in. The gift, still wrapped in its bright paper, lay discarded at her feet. The pain of its rejection, the rejection of her, was the worst ache of all. And in the quiet aftermath, when the sobs had stopped but the weight of everything lingered, Helen knew one thing: she was truly alone. The office smelled faintly of leather and old paper. The walls, lined with thick bookshelves, towered above Helen, who sat on a worn leather chair, her hands resting lightly in her lap. The quiet buzz of a distant fax machine hummed in the background as Ethan Ross, the attorney, sorted through a stack of documents. He was a man in his 50s, professional, composed, but there was something in his eyes that told Helen he had seen this kind of situation before. He looked up from the papers, his expression grave. "I've reviewed your husband's estate documents, Mrs. Brooks, and I have to tell you, I'm shocked." Helen's pulse quickened, her throat tightening. "Shocked? Why?" He pushed a thick file across the table toward her, the rustle of the paper loud in the quiet room. "This." He tapped the top of the stack. "Your husband, before his passing, left you partial guardianship rights over Caleb." Helen's breath caught in her chest, her hands trembling as she reached for the papers. What does that mean? "I have guardianship?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, partial guardianship. You have the legal right to make decisions for Caleb if Ryan and Meadow are unavailable, or if it's in Caleb's best interest. It's not full guardianship, but it's significant. It means you have a say in his life." Helen's heart raced. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could feel a flicker of hope. She had always believed that her connection with Caleb, the bond they shared, was something irreplaceable. But was it enough? She looked at the papers again, her eyes scanning the fine print. The words seemed to blur together for a moment, but then one sentence jumped out at her. "Meadow never told Ryan about this," Ethan added, his voice lowering. This is something she's kept hidden. I don't think he even knows." Helen stared at the papers, her mind reeling. Meadow had hidden this from Ryan? Why? The realization struck her like a blow. The woman who had already pushed her out of her own family was now keeping secret, hiding things that could give Helen a chance to reconnect with Caleb. Ethan watched her carefully, as though he could sense the whirlpool of thoughts racing through her mind. "There's more," he said quietly, leaning forward. "I've also found something else in your husband's trust." Helen's stomach lurched. "What else?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "There's a family trust. In your name." Helen's eyes widened. "A trust? Not just any trust," Ethan said, his tone taking on a more serious edge. "It's a significant amount of money, earmarked specifically for you and Caleb. It seems your husband wanted to make sure you were taken care of, financially, if anything ever happened to him." Helen blinked, feeling the room spin slightly. "I didn't know about any of this. Why didn't anyone tell me?" "That's the point," Ethan replied, his voice growing firmer. "Meadow knew about it. She knew. And she kept it from Ryan. She didn't want him to know about the trust, and she certainly didn't want you to have access to it. This is about money, Mrs. Brooks. Money and control." Helen's heart sank, her chest tightening with the weight of his words. Money and control. It was always about money, wasn't it? Meadow's desire to create the perfect family, to control everything, including Caleb. And now she was using Ryan to further isolate Helen, keeping her in the shadows while lining her own pocket. It was the only explanation that made sense. Meadow wasn't just pushing Helen out, she was trying to erase her completely from Caleb's life. Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts. "You need to understand, Mrs. Brooks. Meadow has motives. She's not just after your son, she's after power. She wants everything, the money, the control. And she's using Ryan to get it." Helen shook her head, her mind a whirlwind. She paused, trying to gather her thoughts. "I just want Caleb. I want to be in his life. I want to be there for him." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in front of him. "I understand that, but if she's erasing you, you have options. Legally, you have options." Helen stared at him, her throat tight with emotion. "What do you mean?" Ethan's gaze softened, but there was still a steely determination in his eyes. "We can challenge this. We can go to court. If she's trying to cut you out, we can bring you back. We can fight for your rights to be in Caleb's life. Legally, you deserve that." Helen felt her heart skip a beat. Could this really be happening? Could she actually fight? For Caleb, for the family that had been slowly taken from her? But even as hope flickered, another thought crept in. The fear that Ryan would never support her, that he had already been poisoned by Meadow's lies. He had already turned his back on her once. "I don't know," Helen murmured, her voice trembling. "Ryan, he's already so far gone. He believes her." Ethan's gaze softened, but his voice was firm. "You can't let that stop you. This isn't about Ryan anymore. This is about Caleb. This is about your rights as a grandmother. You don't have to sit by and let them erase you from his life." Helen's mind swirled with the possibility. Could she really do this? Could she fight against Meadow's lies and deceit? Could she get back the family she had lost? But then, a sinking feeling tugged at her gut. Was it too late? The moment stretched between them, the weight of the decision hanging in the air like a fragile thread. Finally, Helen nodded slowly, her voice a whisper of resolve. "Let's do it. Let's fight for him." Ethan's eyes hardened with determination. "We'll start immediately, and I'll make sure you're not erased." As she stood to leave, the weight of the papers in her hands felt like the first step toward something more than just survival. It was the first step toward reclaiming the family that Meadow had tried to steal from her. But as Helen walked out of the office, one question lingered. Was it too late to save Caleb? The morning air felt cold against Helen's skin as she made her way into the hospital for another round of treatment. The familiar fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the sound almost deafening in the stillness. She felt like a ghost drifting through the sterile hallways, a shell of the woman she had been. The sharp sting of isolation still lingered, even here, surrounded by the hum of machines and the occasional murmur of nurses moving about their duties. She had spent days in this fog, haunted by the thought of losing Caleb completely. The legal battle felt so daunting, so impossibly large, and every step forward felt like it might be the last. But this morning, there was something different. A flicker of hope, small but bright, bloomed in her chest. As she entered the waiting area, she saw Tasha, the nurse who had become something of a quiet friend. Tasha had always been kind, but today, There was an unspoken understanding between them. Helen's eyes met hers, and Tasha gave a slight nod, signaling that she was ready to talk. "How are you feeling?" Tasha asked, her voice a soft contrast to the bustling hospital sounds. "Better," Helen replied, the word coming out more easily than she expected. "I'm hanging in there." Tasha's eyes softened, a look of sympathy in them. "I've been thinking about you, Mrs. Brooks, and I know what Meadow said. I heard it. About you. In the hospital. And, well, I want you to know that I don't think it's right, what she said. And if you're going to fight this, I'll be there for you." Helen blinked, surprised, unsure if she'd heard her correctly. "You'll help me?" Tasha gave a small, firm nod. "If you want me to, I'll testify. About what I heard her say. I know it's not much, but maybe it's the push you need." Helen's throat tightened, and she blinked rapidly to stave off the sudden rush of tears. Meadow had mocked her here, in this very place, and Tasha had heard it. For the first time in weeks, Helen felt the weight of her isolation lift, even if just slightly. It was someone, on her side. "I don't know what to say," Helen whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. I didn't think I had anyone left. Not really." "You've got me," Tasha said, her voice steady, a warmth in her words. "You've got more than just me. You've got your fight. And Caleb. Don't forget him." Helen looked down at her hands, feeling the truth of Tasha's words settle deep within her. Caleb. He was everything. The fight wasn't just for her anymore, it was for him. For the child who had been pushed away, whose love was still a tether, however fragile, that she could cling to. She could almost feel his little hand in hers again, warm and safe. But that image, that fleeting comfort, was quickly replaced with the cold reality of her situation. What if it was already too late? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of the moment. Helen pulled it out, her fingers trembling as she looked at the screen. It was a text from Ryan. Her heart leapt into her throat before she saw that it was simply another refusal. "Ryan has declined your call," the message read. Her stomach twisted in disappointment, but she had expected it. Meadow was intercepting him, turning him against her, erasing her. She shoved the phone back into her bag, pushing down the raw ache of rejection that crawled up her throat. Ryan had already decided. He'd sided with Meadow, and the love between mother and son felt like a distant memory, one she couldn't reach no matter how hard she tried. But just as she was about to walk away, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message that made her stop dead in her tracks. It was a note from Caleb. "Grandma, don't leave me." Her heart stopped, and everything around her blurred. The words on the screen seemed to pulse, the simple plea cutting through the fog of hopelessness like a beacon. "Don't leave me." He was asking for her. He was reaching for her. Even though he couldn't understand the complexity of the situation, she could almost hear his voice in her head, his small, hesitant words. "Don't leave me." Helen's chest tightened, tears welling in her eyes. She couldn't lose him. Not now. Not when there was still a glimmer of hope, no matter how small. She blinked rapidly, her breath shallow as the message glowed on the screen. Caleb needed her, and she wasn't going to give up on him. Not when he was reaching out like this. The decision was clear. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for him. She stood up straighter, her resolve hardening with every passing moment. "I'll do whatever it takes," she whispered to herself, feeling the weight of the words settle inside her. "I'll fight for him, for Caleb." Her heart, though heavy, felt a spark of strength ignite within her. She had Tasha on her side. She had the law on her side. She had something to fight for, something real, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. As she left the hospital, the door swinging open with a soft chime, Helen felt the cold night air brush her skin. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel alone. She had Caleb, and she would fight for him, no matter the cost. The cold metal of the courtroom chair pressed against Helen's back as she sat, watching the lawyers shuffle papers. The stark white walls felt suffocating. The buzz of murmurs echoed through the space, but the silence between her and Ryan was deafening. Across the room, Meadow sat with her arms crossed, her face a mask of control. She looked like a queen ruling over a kingdom she had forged. But Helen wasn't going to give up. Not this time. Ethan, her lawyer, had been quiet for most of the morning, carefully sifting through the evidence. Now, as the proceedings paused for a moment, He leaned over to Helen, his voice low, urgent. "You're going to want to hear this," Ethan said, holding up a small recorder. Helen looked at it, confused. "What is that?" "It's a recording," Ethan explained, his fingers lightly tapping the device. "One of your husband's, his last attempt to warn you." Helen blinked, her heart skipping a beat. "My husband? How? What is this?" Ethan gave her a somber look, understanding the shock in her eyes. "Before he passed, your husband had some serious concerns. He foresaw what might happen if Meadow took control. He took some precautions." The weight of Ethan's words sunk into Helen's chest. She couldn't believe it, couldn't fathom what he was saying. Had Jack, her late husband, really anticipated all of this? He had been a quiet man, rarely one to stir the pot, but could he have known that Meadow would try to erase her from their family? Ethan pressed a button on the recorder. It clicked on, and then a low voice filled the room. A voice Helen recognized immediately. Meadows. The words came out slow, casual, as if she were discussing nothing more important than the weather. "Once she's gone," Meadows' voice drifted from the recorder, "things will be easier. Ryan and I will have what we need. Caleb will be fine. It's just a matter of time." Helen's breath caught in her throat. "Once she's gone." The words echoed through her mind like a punch. How had she not seen it before? Meadow had never cared about her, not truly, but hearing it so plainly, so coldly, in Meadow's own voice, was like hearing her own future being written out in front of her. Helen turned to Ethan, her eyes wide with disbelief. This can't be real." Ethan nodded grimly. "It's real, and it's admissible evidence in court. This is what we've been waiting for." Helen's heart raced. She felt as though the ground beneath her was shifting, her world turning upside down. All this time, Meadow had been playing a game she thought she could win. But now, with this evidence, things had changed. The rules had shifted. The courtroom had gone eerily silent as the recording continued to play, Meadow's voice casually discussing Helen's fate. Her eyes stung with the sting of betrayal, and yet, something else flickered in her chest, an ember of hope. She wasn't done yet. "Once she's gone," Meadow had said, as though it were nothing more than a casual observation. But Helen wasn't gone, and she wasn't going anywhere. Ethan placed the recorder on the table, the silence in the room now palpable. The judge leaned forward, her eyes sharp, assessing. There was no denying what they had just heard. Meadow's words were damning. "Your Honor," Ethan spoke, his voice steady and confident. "This evidence speaks for itself. We ask that it be entered into the record." Helen's pulse hammered in her ears. She had felt like a shadow for so long, an afterthought, someone pushed to the edge of her own life. But now, this moment, this could be her turning point. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was fighting for her family, for Caleb, and she was going to win. But before the judge could respond, Helen felt a hand on her shoulder, a small, familiar weight. She turned her head, and there was Caleb, standing in the hallway outside the courtroom, his eyes wide, his small body trembling. He had slipped past the court officer just to be close to her. Helen's heart broke. He was here. Despite everything Meadow had done to pull him away, despite all the distance between them, Caleb was still fighting to be with her. The moment felt suspended in time, a fragile thread connecting them across the distance. Caleb looked at her with wide, desperate eyes, his small hand lifting, reaching for her. "Grandma," he whispered, his voice small but filled with such sincerity. "Don't leave me." Helen's throat tightened, her eyes stinging as she fought back tears. He was fighting for her. He wasn't going to let her go. The courtroom had become a blur of voices, but Helen's world had narrowed to Caleb, his hand, his desperate plea. She didn't care about anything else at that moment. Not Meadow, not the legal battle. She reached out, her arms trembling, and Caleb rushed toward her, clinging to her side. Meadow's voice had done its damage, but it was Caleb's love that pulled Helen back from the edge. "Don't leave me," Caleb repeated, his small voice breaking. Helen's breath hitched, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt like she could breathe. "I won't leave you," she thought. Not now, not ever. But even as she held him close, the battle wasn't over. Meadow had underestimated the love that could fight back. She had underestimated the strength that had been hidden for so long. Helen looked at the judge, the evidence now in her favor, and knew this fight wasn't over. but for the first time she felt like she had a chance, and this time, she would win. The courtroom was heavy with tension, the air thick with anticipation. The judge sat at the front, her eyes sharp, her face a mask of professional neutrality. Helen sat next to Ethan, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Her heart thudded in her chest, drowning out the faint rustling of papers and murmurs from the gallery. Her eyes were fixed on the witness stand, where Meadow now stood, her posture straight and proud, a picture of cool confidence. Meadow's gaze swept over the room, her lips curling into a tight smile as she began to speak. I'm here today because I believe my mother-in-law's condition has made her unstable, she said, her voice smooth and rehearsed. She has refused to accept her place in our family. Her behavior has been erratic, and quite frankly, dangerous. And now, with her illness, it's gotten worse. Helen felt her chest tighten, but she didn't look away. Meadow was playing the role of the victim, painting Helen as the villain, as though she were some kind of burden. Every word Meadow spoke felt like a knife twisting in Helen's side, but she stayed silent, her eyes never leaving the woman who had stolen her family from her. She's cancer-addled, Meadow continued, her voice laced with condescension. She's losing touch with reality. She accuses me of things I've never done. She's tearing our family apart. The words were cutting, cruel, but what stung most was the cold certainty with which Meadow said them. She had rehearsed this moment, had prepared herself to destroy Helen's credibility, to paint her as the crazy, unstable one. The audacity, the malice, was almost too much to bear. Helen's hands shook at her sides, but Ethan's steady presence beside her calmed her, just enough to stay composed. He had warned her that Meadow would do everything to discredit her, to make her seem unfit, unworthy of the family she had spent so many years building. Meadow's testimony seemed to be working, the judge's face unreadable, her attention fixed on the woman who stood before her. Helen could feel the weight of the room shift, the scales tipping ever so slightly against her. But then Ethan stood up, his voice clear, confident, cutting through the tension. "Your Honor," he said, his tone unyielding, "I'd like to submit counter-evidence." The judge gave a slight nod, and Ethan turned to Helen, then back to the court. He picked up a stack of papers and placed them on the table, sliding them toward the judge. As he did, the room fell into a charged silence. "These are recordings," Ethan began, "recordings of conversations between Mrs. Brooks's late husband Jack and his son Ryan, in which Jack expresses concerns about Meadow's manipulation and the financial motives behind her actions. These recordings are essential to understanding the depth of Meadow's deceit and her attempts to isolate Mrs. Brooks from her family." Helen held her breath as Ethan continued. He was holding nothing back. Meadow's mask was about to crack, wide open. "And here," Ethan added, his finger tapping the next set of papers, "we have financial emails that show a pattern of control, of deliberate concealment of family assets. These emails were intentionally hidden from Mrs. Brooks, preventing her from accessing her rights as a beneficiary." Helen's heart pounded in her chest, each word Ethan spoke a blow against the twisted version of reality Meadow had so carefully constructed. This was it, the evidence, the truth. Meadow couldn't hide anymore. The judge, her brow furrowed, turned her gaze to Meadow, who had stiffened on the witness stand, her expression faltering for the first time. The silence in the room grew thick, the air heavy with the weight of truth. Meadow's voice broke the quiet, her eyes flashing with anger as she shot back. "This is all a lie. These are fabrications. You can't possibly believe her." But the judge remained unfazed. "I've heard enough," she said, her voice stern, final. "We'll take a recess. I need time to review the evidence. Mrs. Brooks, you may step down." Helen stood, her legs weak beneath her. Ethan placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, and they walked out of the courtroom together. Her pulse was still racing, but now it was a race toward something different, a hope she hadn't dared to feel in so long. Outside the courtroom, the hallways were quiet, but as Helen passed the door to the chambers, a voice called out to her. A small voice, so soft she almost didn't hear it. "Grandma." Helen froze. Her heart leapt in her chest. She turned, her eyes scanning the hallway, and there, standing in the doorway to the chambers, was Caleb. His eyes were wide, his small frame standing in front of the door like he wasn't supposed to be there. But he was. and that was all that mattered. He took a step toward her, his little hand reaching out, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to see you, Grandma." Tears stung Helen's eyes as she rushed toward him, pulling him into her arms. For a moment, the world outside the courtroom, the battle, the cruelty, it all faded. There was only Caleb, her grandson, in her arms, warm and real, and so desperately needed. Helen closed her eyes, savoring the moment, knowing that this was the truth that mattered. She wasn't alone, she hadn't been erased, and no matter what happened next, she would fight for him, for Caleb. The return. The door to the small bungalow creaked open, and a burst of fresh air swept in as Caleb stepped inside. His eyes were wide, scanning the room with a quiet curiosity. It had been so long since he'd been here, and yet, it felt like nothing had changed. The worn armchairs, the photo albums stacked on the side table, everything was the same, but it wasn't. Not really. Nothing felt the same without him. Helen stood in the doorway watching him carefully. Her chest tightened as she took in the sight of her grandson, now taller, his face a little more mature, but still that same boy she had once held in her arms. Her heart swelled. She didn't know how long she'd waited for this moment, the simple joy of having him here, in her home, where he belonged. Caleb's eyes met hers, and a smile tugged at his lips, tentative at first, then widening as he stepped forward. The warmth of it sent a wave of relief through Helen, easing the tightness in her chest. She rushed to him, dropping to her knees and wrapping her arms around him in a tight embrace. For a moment, she didn't want to let go. "You're really here," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "I missed you so much." Caleb hugged her back, burying his face against her shoulder. "I missed you too, Grandma." They stood like that for a long moment, the world outside their little bubble fading away. It was as if the fight, the battles, and the pain of the past months no longer mattered. For now, there was only the warmth of Caleb in her arms, the soothing rhythm of their heartbeats in sync. Eventually, they pulled away, and Caleb looked around the room, his eyes landing on the old photo albums on the coffee table. "Can we look at these?" he asked, his voice soft but eager. Helen nodded, a gentle smile tugging at her lips. "Of course, let's sit down." They settled on the couch, the albums between them as Helen opened the first one. The pages were worn, the corners of the photos curling slightly with age, but the memories were clear. Caleb as a toddler, running through the backyard, laughing at some silly joke she'd made. Ryan, younger, his face full of innocence before the weight of the world began to shape him. Helen found herself laughing, the sound foreign at first, but then natural as Caleb pointed out something silly in each photo. The laughter came easily, like they hadn't been torn apart by the years. It was a connection that no one could erase, not even Meadow. "Remember when we made that big snowman in the front yard?" Helen asked, her eyes bright as she flipped to a picture of Caleb in his puffy winter coat, his little arms raised triumphantly in front of a massive mound of snow. Caleb laughed, nodding. "Yeah, I thought it was a giant." They went through more photos, sharing stories and laughter, and with each passing moment, it felt like a small piece of the world was healing. Helen could feel the weight lifting off her shoulders, the exhaustion from chemo, the uncertainty, the fear. It all faded into the background. She had Caleb, and that was enough. Later that evening, after dinner, they sat on the couch together, the room growing quieter as night fell. Caleb had his head on her shoulder, his eyes drooping with sleepiness. Helen stroked his hair, lost in the warmth of the moment. For the first time in so long, she felt like she could breathe. She could still fight, for herself, for him. But the sound of the front door opening startled her from her thoughts. Helen looked up, her heart leaping as Ryan stepped into the living room. His eyes immediately met hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. He stood in the doorway, his shoulders tense, his gaze conflicted, guilt clearly written on his face. I just wanted to check in," Ryan said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "Is everything okay?" Helen's heart wavered. She could see the guilt in his eyes, the hesitation in his posture, like he wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. Her stomach twisted, the hope of this moment tinged with the pain of everything that had come before. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "I want to believe that you're here because you see what's happening, that you see me for who I am." Ryan took a step toward them, but the walls between them still seemed insurmountable. He looked down at Caleb, who was half asleep, nestled against her shoulder. His gaze softened, but there was still that distance, the space that Meadow had created between them. I don't know what to think anymore, Ryan admitted quietly. It's like everything's been turned upside down and I can't make sense of it. But I know I haven't been fair to you, Mom. I'm sorry for that. Helen's breath caught in her throat, her heart breaking at the words she had longed to hear. But there was still a wall there, an unspoken barrier that she couldn't break through. Not yet, not fully. It's not too late, Ryan, she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet, aching hope. We can fix this. We can make it right. Ryan's face softened, but he didn't respond right away. He reached out, brushing his fingers lightly over Caleb's hair, then looked back at Helen. I'll try, he said, his voice faltering. I'll try. Before he could say more, the front door slammed shut, and they both turned toward it, startled. Meadow's voice cut through the stillness, sharp and furious. You can't let this happen, Ryan. You can't let her take him away. Helen felt her stomach drop. Meadow was here, and the battle, the real battle, was just beginning. Ryan's face hardened as he turned to leave, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood. Helen knew that he wasn't ready yet, that he still had to see the truth, but Caleb was in her arms, and no one could take that from her. As he left, Helen whispered softly to Caleb, his little body still warm against her side. No one can block this love, sweet boy. No one. And she meant it. No one could take her grandson from her. Not now. Not ever. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Meadow sat in the witness box, her composure unshaken. She had spent weeks portraying herself as the victim, battling for her family, protecting Caleb from a dangerous grandmother. Her voice was smooth, rehearsed, her words laced with false sincerity. But Helen was starting to feel a flicker of hope. The evidence was mounting. The truth was creeping to the surface. Ethan stood, his expression calm but determined. He walked to the front of the room, a stack of papers in his hand. Your Honor, he began, his voice steady, I'd like to submit new evidence into the record. This, we believe, demonstrates the true intent behind Meadow's actions. He placed the papers on the table, sliding them towards the judge. The courtroom fell silent as everyone leaned in, waiting for the next revelation. Meadow, Ethan continued, his tone biting, you've been quite vocal on social media. We have screenshots of several posts you made over the past few months. Posts where you flaunted your fresh start after pushing Mrs. Brooks out of your life. Meadow's eyes narrowed. What does this have to do with anything? Her voice, though calm, had a sharp edge. Ethan's lips curled into a slight, knowing smile. It's simple. Your posts, the ones where you've labeled your new life as perfect, show clear intent to erase Helen from your family's narrative. You've been publicly painting her as an outsider, someone no longer welcome in your home. He clicked through the slides, revealing the images of Meadow's posts. In one, Meadow stood with Caleb, smiling brightly, the caption reading, "A fresh start with my real family, blessed future new beginnings." In another, a family portrait with Ryan and Caleb, no sign of Helen, the caption reading, "The perfect little family, finally complete." Helen's chest tightened as she watched Meadow's smug smile on the screen, the words she had seen so many times now laid bare in front of the court. There it was, the proof of her exclusion, of the cruel manipulation Helen had suspected all along. The judge's eyes flicked from the posts to Meadow, her expression impassive. Meadow, the judge said, her voice tinged with reproach. These posts are highly concerning. Meadow's smile faltered for the briefest moment, but she quickly recovered. Your Honor, she said, her voice tight, those posts were meant to help me move forward. I've had to deal with my own pain, my own loss. This woman, she gestured toward Helen, is not healthy for our family. Her illness, her manipulations, they have taken a toll on all of us. Helen felt a familiar fire stir in her chest. She wanted to stand up and scream, but she stayed silent, letting the evidence speak for itself. She'd been pushed aside, erased, and now Meadow's own words, her own arrogance, were working against her. Ethan wasn't finished. There's more, he said, his voice crisp, tapping another file onto the table. He opened it to reveal a series of financial records. These emails were hidden from Mrs. Brooks. They show a clear pattern of deception and control over the family trust. Meadow has been deliberately keeping funds from Helen, manipulating the family's finances to her advantage. The courtroom was still, the gravity of the situation settling in. Meadow's face turned pale, her mask starting to crack. The veneer of control she had so carefully constructed was shattering. Ryan sat in the back, his eyes glued to the table. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, guilt, shame, maybe even disbelief, crossing his face. Ethan turned to him. "Ryan," he said softly, "you've seen the posts, you've seen the emails. It's time. Time to face the truth about what your wife has been doing." The words hit Ryan like a punch. He looked up at Helen, his eyes wide, and for the first time in ages she saw something in them, a flicker of the sun she once knew. I didn't want to see it," he said, his voice breaking. "But I can't deny it anymore. I was blind, Mom. I'm sorry." Helen's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't enough. Not yet. But it was a start. After all this time, after everything Meadow had done, Ryan was finally starting to see her for who she truly was. A woman capable of anything to get what she wanted, including destroying the family that had once been united. Meadow's face twisted with rage, her composure now completely shattered. "You can't do this, Ryan. You can't believe her over me." Her voice rose in pitch, a sharp edge creeping in. But Ryan didn't back down. His voice was firm, though it trembled with emotion. I have to see the truth. I can't keep living in this lie." Meadow's hands clenched into fists, her whole body trembling with fury. She shot a glance toward Helen, her eyes burning with resentment. "You will regret this," she hissed. "Both of you." The room was still as her threat echoed in the silence. It wasn't over yet. Helen could feel the walls closing in, the final pieces of the puzzle falling into place. She had Ryan back, at least in part. But Meadow wasn't going down quietly. She could see it now. The fight for Caleb was far from over. But as Helen met the judge's gaze, she knew one thing for certain. Meadow had underestimated the power of truth, the power of love, and she was about to lose it all. The judge cleared her throat, bringing the proceedings to a halt. "I will need time to review this new evidence," she said. "We will reconvene in 2 days." Helen's heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't over yet. But the first cracks had appeared in Meadow's fortress. Helen wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. As the courtroom emptied, Helen caught Caleb's gaze across the hallway. His small face, still filled with uncertainty, watched her with those trusting eyes. And in that moment, she knew she had won. For him. For her family. She wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. Not now. Not ever. The courtroom was heavy with tension, the air thick with the weight of the final reckoning. Helen sat at the edge of her seat, her hands resting, calm but firm, on the table. Ethan stood beside her, his presence a pillar of strength. The final trial had begun, and this was the moment that would determine everything. Meadow's mask was about to shatter completely. The judge, an experienced woman whose gaze had been sharp and discerning throughout. The trial sat at the bench, her attention unwavering. Helen felt her pulse quicken as she watched Ethan approach the front of the room. Today, it would all come out. "Your Honor," Ethan began, his voice steady and commanding, "we have gathered the final pieces of evidence that will conclusively prove the manipulation, deceit, and control that Meadow has exerted over this family." He turned to the table, carefully picking up the final set of documents, his fingers brushing over the pages with a sense of finality. "What we have here are signed documents related to the family trust," he continued, "but upon review, we've discovered that they were forged." Helen's breath caught in her throat. She had known that Meadow was capable of anything, but hearing the word forged in this courtroom, hearing it confirmed, was a revelation that turned her world upside down. Ethan tapped the stack of papers, sending a ripple of silence through the courtroom. These documents, which Meadow tried to present as legitimate, were tampered with, her signature forged on multiple pages, in an attempt to seize control of the family's assets and strip Mrs. Brooks of her rights. Meadow's face went pale, her mask slipping for the first time. She shot a glare at the judge, her body tense with fury, but it was too late. The evidence had been laid bare, and the truth was undeniable. "Forgery," Ethan said, his voice carrying across the room. This is the last of her lies. She's not only manipulated the family but sought to steal what rightfully belongs to Helen. This was not just an attempt to isolate her, it was an outright power grab. Helen's heart thundered in her chest. She had feared this moment for so long, but now, with the truth in her grasp, she felt something else. A deep, unshakable resolve. This was her time. The truth had been exposed, and now Meadow could no longer hide behind her lies. Ryan shifted in his seat, his expression conflicted. It was as if the final puzzle piece had fallen into place, and the weight of everything that had happened was finally crashing down on him. He stood, his voice shaky as he addressed the room. I didn't want to see it, Ryan admitted, his voice quiet but filled with anguish. I didn't want to believe what Meadow had done, but now I can't deny it anymore. She manipulated me, she lied to me, and I'm sorry, Mom. I should have seen it sooner. Helen felt her breath hitch at his words, a mixture of relief and heartbreak flooding through her. He was finally starting to see her. The mother he had once known, the woman he had lost to Meadow's lies. It was a small victory, but it was one that carried enormous weight. Meadow's face twisted in fury, her eyes flashing with contempt as she looked at Ryan. You don't know what you're saying, she spat. She's been poisoning you with lies, Ryan. All of this, it's a scheme to tear us apart. Ryan flinched, but this time, he didn't back down. He met his wife's gaze, the conflict in his eyes fading as the truth took root. No, Meadow, it's you who's been lying. It's you who's been tearing this family apart. The courtroom was silent as Meadow's words faltered, the once unshakable woman now cracking under the weight of her own deceit. She stood, her hands trembling, her body rigid with anger. I won't let this happen, she hissed, but there was no conviction left in her voice. The judge's voice rang out, cutting through the chaos. Enough, she said sharply. I've heard enough. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the room as the gravity of the situation sank in. Meadow, I'm afraid your attempts to manipulate and deceive this court have failed. Based on the evidence presented, I find that you have acted in bad faith and sought to undermine the rights of your mother-in-law. The custody of Caleb, as well as control of the family assets, will be granted to Mrs. Brooks. Helen's heart soared as the words washed over her. The legal battle was over. She had won. Caleb would stay with her. But the final blow came when the judge added, Meadow Brooks, you are stripped of all custodial rights and access to the family trust. You are no longer a legal guardian of Caleb, and any further contact with him will be strictly supervised. Meadow's face drained of color, her eyes locked with Helen's, a silent fury burning behind them. She stepped back, her mask completely shattered, and for the first time, Helen saw the true extent of her betrayal. Helen's breath was shaky, but she stood tall. This was her moment, this was her family, and she would protect it. No one would take Caleb from her again. No one. As the courtroom emptied, a small voice called out, Grandma? Helen turned, and there, standing just outside the door, was Caleb. His small face was filled with uncertainty, but his eyes held something far deeper. A trust, a longing that Helen couldn't ignore. She rushed toward him, her arms wide open, and in that moment, the world seemed to fall away. I'm so proud of you, she whispered, pulling him into an embrace. I'll never let you go, sweet boy. You're mine, forever. Ryan stood at the back, watching them. He stepped forward, his expression softening as he saw Caleb in Helen's arms. He nodded, the weight of his mistakes heavy but, for the first time, acknowledging the truth. Meadow's attempts had failed. The battle was over, and Helen had won. But as she held Caleb close, she couldn't help but wonder, would Meadow ever truly accept defeat? Would she ever leave their lives, or was the fight just beginning? The light in the room was soft, casting a warm glow across the worn armchairs and the simple, comforting space Helen had come to know as her sanctuary. The quiet hum of the chemotherapy machine was the only sound that filled the air, a constant companion. Yet, today it didn't feel like a burden, it felt like a stepping stone. Helen sat in the chair, the sterile drip of the IV flowing steadily into her arm, but her focus was elsewhere. Caleb, sitting cross-legged on the floor next to her, was lost in the world of his drawings. His fingers moved swiftly, the crayon almost a blur as he carefully colored in a picture of a sun-drenched park. His laughter bubbled up in the air, an innocent sound that filled the room with joy, a melody Helen had longed to hear again. The sight of him so carefree, so full of life, was a balm to her heart. She couldn't help but smile as she watched him, her thoughts drifting. She was still battling cancer, still tethered to the hospital and the endless treatment, but with Caleb by her side, every day felt like a victory. Every moment was a small triumph against the pain that threatened to steal her strength. "Grandma," Caleb said, his voice soft but filled with wonder. "Look, I drew us at the park just like before." Helen's chest tightened, and she turned her attention fully to the paper, a picture she hadn't seen in so long, the two of them, hand in hand, walking beneath a big tree, with the sun shining down in perfect golden beams. It was their world, simple and beautiful. A world that Meadow had tried to erase, but one that Caleb had helped her rebuild. "It's beautiful, sweet boy," Helen said, her voice thick with emotion. She reached over to ruffle his hair, watching as his face lit up with pride. In this moment, she felt like she had finally come back to life, not just surviving, but living again. The door creaked open, and Ryan entered the room, his expression conflicted, his eyes shadowed by guilt. Helen didn't need to see him clearly to know that his journey wasn't finished. His eyes still held the weight of the past, of his mistakes, of the things he had done and left undone. But in them now there was a glimmer of something else, remorse, a quiet desire to make things right. I wanted to apologize, Mom," Ryan said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. He shifted uneasily, glancing at Caleb before meeting her gaze. "For everything, for not seeing the truth sooner. I let her control me, and I failed you." Helen's heart clenched, but she didn't react immediately. She had always known that Ryan had been trapped in Meadow's web. She'd seen it in his eyes all those years, the way he'd been torn, between loyalty to her and the pull of his wife. But now, here he was, broken, trying to find his way back. "I didn't want to hurt you," Ryan continued, his voice thick with regret. "I thought I was doing what was best, but I see now. I see how wrong I was. I see how much I've hurt you, and Caleb too." Helen let the silence stretch between them, the weight of his words hanging in the air. She had suffered, and she had fought. But this was the moment that mattered. The truth had come to light, and Ryan had finally woken up. But forgiveness, she knew, would take time. There were no shortcuts for what they had been through. "I'm cautious, Ryan," she said slowly, her voice soft yet steady. "But I'm also hopeful. You've got a lot to make up for, and I won't forget what you allowed to happen. But I see you. And that means something." Ryan nodded, his throat tightening as he absorbed her words. He glanced at Caleb again, his eyes softening at the sight of his son lost in the simplicity of drawing. Caleb didn't even look up as Ryan stepped closer, but Helen could see the way his hands trembled slightly. It was a start. He wasn't where he needed to be, but he was trying. And for that, she would allow him the chance. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang. Tasha stood on the other side, a wide grin on her face, her eyes sparkling with pride. Helen's heart lifted at the sight of her best friend, the one person who had stood by her through everything. Tasha was a constant, a reminder that there was still love and laughter in the world, despite the pain they had endured. "You look stronger," Tasha remarked as she entered, her gaze taking in the scene, the light in Helen's eyes, the way Caleb was still happily drawing, and Ryan's hesitant presence. "This place, it feels like home again." Helen smiled softly, but the tears that threatened to pool in her eyes were not from sorrow, they were from gratitude. "I'm trying," she said quietly. "It's been a long road, but I think I can make it." Tasha placed a hand on her shoulder, squeezing it gently. "I know you will," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "You're not just surviving, Helen. You're living again, and I'm so proud of you." Helen felt a lump form in her throat, but it wasn't sadness. It was relief. There was hope again. It wasn't just about the fight for her grandson. It was about the fight for her life, for herself. As she sat back in her chair, Caleb's laughter once again filling the room, Helen couldn't help but feel a stirring inside her. She wasn't just battling cancer anymore. She was battling the cruelty that had tried to take everything from her. And she would survive. Not just cancer, not just the lies, but the darkness that had once felt so all-consuming. She would survive it all. For Caleb, for herself. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, the promise of tomorrow felt within reach. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. She was ready. The house was filled with the warmth of Sunday dinner, the kind that made the walls hum with life. The kitchen smelled of garlic, rosemary, and roasted chicken. Simple, comforting aromas that Helen hadn't realized she'd missed until now. As she set the table, her movements were slow, deliberate, but there was a lightness in her step, a lightness she hadn't felt in years. Her hair, still growing back in soft, silken waves, brushed against her neck, a reminder of the battle she'd won, not just against the disease but against the darkness that had once threatened to consume her. Helen paused for a moment, standing in the doorway of the kitchen and watching the scene unfold in her living room. Caleb was sitting cross-legged on the rug, sketching away at his latest masterpiece, his pencil moving furiously, his face concentrated, lips slightly parted. Ryan and Ethan were at the table, talking softly, their voices carrying over the clink of silverware as they set the plates. Tasha was arranging the glasses, making sure everything was perfect. It was so normal, the kind of warmth that felt like a soft blanket wrapped around her heart, one she never thought she'd feel again. The emptiness that had once haunted the corners of her home was gone now, replaced by this, the sound of laughter, the clatter of utensils, the shared glances between people who'd once been strangers in their own family, but were now finding their way back to each other. "Dinner's ready?" Helen called, her voice full of life and something else, joy. The group gathered around the table, Caleb sitting next to her, his small body just slightly too big to fit on the chair comfortably, but still making it work. His eyes sparkled with a mischief that Helen recognized well, the same gleam that had once filled his father's gaze. Ryan, across from her, had his eyes trained on Caleb, but there was a softness to them now. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying, and for that, she could still hope. Ethan sat next to Tasha, giving Helen a quick, knowing smile, his quiet presence a steady anchor in this sea of newfound peace. He had become not just her lawyer, but her friend, someone who believed in her when no one else had, and never asked for anything in return. They sat down, the clink of silverware and the hum of conversation filling the air. The warmth of the meal, the connection between them, was like a balm to her soul. The table was full, but not just with food. It was full of healing, of forgiveness, of second chances. The silence was comfortable, and for the first time in years, it wasn't heavy. Helen raised her glass, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth, the light from the chandelier above reflected in the crystal, shimmering softly in her hand. "To what can't be erased," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Blood, love, and truth." Ryan raised his glass with her, the eyes meeting hers across the table, no longer filled with guilt, but with gratitude. Caleb looked up at her, his eyes wide, the trust between them unspoken but understood. "To what can't be erased," Tasha echoed, her voice warm, full of affection. Ethan nodded, joining in the toast, and as they all lifted their glasses, Helen felt a wave of emotion wash over her. The past, with its cruelty and betrayal, felt so far away now. The pain, though still lingering in the edges of her memories, was no longer the thing that defined her. Instead, it was love, her love for Caleb, her love for her family, and their love for her. Helen's heart swelled as Caleb slid from his chair, making his way over to her, and with a firm squeeze, he wrapped his small arms around her waist. The force of his hug nearly took her breath away, but she welcomed it with open arms, pulling him tightly against her chest. "You never left me, Grandma," he whispered, his voice full of sincerity, as if that truth was the most important thing in the world. Helen closed her eyes for a moment, pressing her cheek to the top of his head. "I'll never leave you," she said softly. "Not now, not ever." For a long moment the world around them faded into the background. All that mattered was Caleb, the warmth of his hug, the reassurance that the world she'd fought so hard to reclaim was finally hers. As she pulled back, her gaze drifted across the table. Ryan, Tasha, Ethan, each one of them had a piece of her heart, but it was Caleb who held the most sacred place. He was her redemption, her reason to fight. She'd been knocked down, betrayed, nearly erased from her own life. But now, with the weight of the truth behind her and love, the most unshakable kind of love, holding her up, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. No one could ever silence her again. The room fell into a comfortable quiet, the kind that comes with belonging, with healing, and Helen, watching her family as they all dug into their dinner, couldn't help but reflect. One missed call nearly erased me, but I answered back, and now, nothing can silence me.